Welcome, everybody, and it's really great to have an opportunity to talk to you this evening. This virtual stuff, of course, doesn't replace the much more interesting, exciting, and sensory, stimulating in-person forays that we all love. And I've missed them. I must admit, I do about 15 or 16 forays every year. Presentations, I probably do about 20, and I much prefer to do them in person, of course, but we do the best we can. And in this sort of new age, as it were, in COVID times, we have to make do. So again, I appreciate you coming online. And as Frank said, if you have questions, you could either hit the chat button right in the upper right-hand corner of your gallery screen, or wait till the end, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and start the presentation. There we go. All right, so this is based on a request from Frank and Lori relative to the medicinal uses of fungi. And of course, you know, were we in person, I'd ask everybody, how many of you have tried medicinal mushrooms or hunted for them? And I'm sure many of you will raise your hands. And of course, if you do have some experience or stories that you want to tell, I'd love to hear them at the end of the program. Because one of the things that I found growing up, and I was very fortunate to grow up with my grandmother who and my grandfather, who were both very active users of herbal medicines. It's really where I got my start. I think I had arnica liniment slapped on my arms and legs when I was probably 4 or 5. I had all kinds of calendula creams for healing bruises and wounds. There were some tinctures that I took every so often, but of course I got more into that when I attended the California School of Herbal Studies as an adult and really got into medicinal uses of wild plants. Right around 77, yeah, it's been a longer time ago than that. I had the occasion to work at what we call the Eco Center in New Hampshire, southwest New Hampshire, at a place called Mount Monadnock. And Mount Monadnock is probably reputedly at this point the most climbed mountain in the world. There are over 5,000 people that ascend the mountain in a single day on a given weekend, especially in the fall. And the owners of the reservation asked me to staff the naturalist station and help guide people if they had questions about anything wild. So in the fall of 77, we had rain that occurred pretty much every weekend from July to October. And instead of 4,000 people a day, I had 4,000 mushrooms a day. And knowing nothing about mushrooms, I figured, okay, I know trees, I know birds. I've looked quite a bit at wildflowers. My supervisor was a botanist, so why not? No one knew about mushrooms in my circle, so I decided to jump right in. And then, of course, as it goes with many of you who have perhaps forayed into the realm of eating mushrooms, I had my first, not fatal, thankfully, but first significant bout with a toxic mushroom. And consequently learned that perhaps I should learn a little bit more. So I took some classes when I was out in Oregon and Washington and pursued that actively, but mostly on my own, using the field guides at the time, which were, of course, very few in number. Well, lo and behold, there was this thing called AIDS that came about in the late 60s, but really hit the ground in the 70s. And for those that are familiar with the early treatments of HIV, fungi figured prominently. And some of you may or may not recall that shiitake was used for extracting a substance called lentinin. And that was one of the immune boosters that were fed to early AIDS patients back in the 70s. And I thought that was fascinating. First, I didn't know mushrooms really were used for, medicine other than, the obvious penicillin and all the psyllins and cyclins and so forth that were synthesized from that original mold in the 1860s, I believe it was. Might have been a little earlier. But I did not know about macrofungi like shiitake being used for medicine. So that was an eye-opener to me, and I got very, very fortunate in running into a colleague at the time by the name of Christopher Hobbs. And Christopher was an herbalist, just like I was becoming, and he also had a fascination with fungi, so much so that he contacted a Chinese doctor who was still in China and got him to translate the original fungi pharmacopoeia in China, which had all of the home remedies using fungi that had been derived from thousands of years of local knowledge. And from that, he published the first and probably what is considered still the best book on medicinal uses of fungi, and it's called Medicinal Fungi of the United States and Canada. And that book, I think the publication date was like 1977 or 78, still stands as one of my favorite go-to guides. So again, Christopher Hobbs, who, by the way, started Rainbow Light Botanicals, and that company's still in operation. You can still buy Rainbow Light herbal tinctures in the grocery stores or health food stores anyway. And then authored this book, which is still a great resource. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in here after that initial introduction. So just to keep in mind, as many of you know, fungi are in their own kingdom. Thankfully, after many of us, or at least some of us perhaps, remember way back when the two plant and animal kingdom system, wherein fungi were in the plant kingdom. But they're different. They're non-modal. They don't move, so they're not like animals. They're heterotrophic in the way that they don't make their own food source. So like animals, they have to get their food and nutrition elsewise. They have defined nuclei in their cells like we do as animals, so hence they're eukaryotic, which is a scientific term for realizing the karyosis is defined. So they're multicellular, and of course the spores are invisible to the naked eye, or even our largest spores are less than 100 microns. A micron is a 1,000th of a millimeter, so they're cryptogamic. They have many, many spores that end up producing perhaps one or two or a few individuals that are reproductively similar. They come in many sizes and shapes, hence heterothallic, and they come with a basic building block of chitin and glucan. And chitin is not unlike cellulose. It just has an alternating chain of polysaccharide cells with a nitrogen bond, and they're very tough. As you know, perhaps if you think about insect cases and shells, that's largely made of the same material, chitin, so it's very tough. Hence, it has a lot to do with its digestibility and the access to the not just the nutrients, but the medicinal properties. You have to be able to unlock those cell walls in order to gain some of the compounds that are medicinally beneficial. And of course, they come in anamorphic or asexual and teleomorphic states. And it may seem that the anamorphic stuff is less pertinent, but if you consider molds as largely anamorphic, and in fact, the conidial molds are some of the most significant medicinal compounds on the planet, that's not insignificant. However, as you know, for example, in this agaricus being depicted here, most of the ones that we are familiar with are sexually reproducing, hence teleomorphic. So, of course, in nature, they recycle nutrients. It's what their largest sort of role in nature, and they're digesting everything, plant and animal matter, other fungi, lichens, algae, you name it, they will digest it. And even your camera lens, there's a fungus that tends to grow on glass. And so there are many different fungi breaking down many different types of substances. And in that, they mediate that exchange of nutrients from one organism to another. And that is perhaps the key feature that gives us the compounds that become medicinally useful for us. That mediation produces various enzymes, various types of glucans, various types of carbohydrates, and of course vitamins and minerals that are a part of that matrix within the cell wall and sometimes latent in the cell wall itself. And of course, we love to eat them. That's part of fungi in nature. It's certainly given us some great food. As most of you know, fungi are sort of been touted as not just brain food, but the perfect diet food in the sense that it's very high in protein. And that's, again, per dry weight, 100 grams between 9.6 and 39%. That's remarkable. You can't even find that high a protein content in most grains. Some grains have that, but most do not. It's also low in fats. And of course, that is something that is for diet watching folks. That's a great thing to say. And yet the fats that they have come in the form of oleic and linoleic acids. And that, of course, depends on the species. Depends on how much butter you add to the pan, but certainly it's a low saturated fat type that is not only easier to digest, but also, as we'll see in a minute, really valuable medicinally. It's low in carbohydrates except for the fiber content, and that fiber content is, as I said, substantial, so much so that children generally can't digest mushrooms even if they're cooked. They say anywhere from 6 months to 6 years before a human digestive system can easily handle, say, the button mushroom from the store. And so that's something that is, is good, has its good parts, and of course is somewhat limited otherwise. They're low in vitamin C, but they're very high in vitamin A and B. And that's something that, again, nutritionally, if you think about establishing a basis of nutrition where your body is fed what it needs, then it prepares the body more aptly for absorption of medicinal compounds. And so that's why I'm focusing a little on the nutritional content, because that, of course, is critical relative to, say, uptaking vitamin A and vitamin B, which doesn't always happen if you have a body condition where that assimilation is not taking place. People sometimes, for example, take niacin because they're low in niacin, and yet it's not because they're not perhaps eating the foods, but it's because their body processes niacin too quickly. So, and vitamin B is just, there are many different types, but niacin being one of them. The mineral contents are also very good, depending upon where the mushroom is grown, whether it's grown in the soil or whether it's grown on trees or other woody material. And it even has trace cations, which, believe it or not, unless you're living in California or Utah or some other place where things like selenium are very naturally high in the groundwater, those of us in the eastern United States tend to live in areas with very low amounts of selenium, and so much so that people have been known to take supplements of selenium because of the low amounts that they naturally get through their foods and through the water. So again, mushrooms concentrating those minerals can be a good source of things that the body generally needs. And all of these, just as a reminder, of course, are enhanced by cooking. As I mentioned, the carbohydrate lattice work of the cell walls inhibits the release of some of those compounds, particularly the minerals, unless those cell walls are broken down upon with heat. So, and not to forget that we have toxic fungi, and of course, most of you know this. Most of you perhaps know somebody who's gotten sick. I sit on the North American Toxicology Committee and help produce the poison reports every year. And every year there is somebody, sort of breaking new ground and eating a mushroom that we either didn't know about or that they were allergic to that was otherwise known to be edible. For example, in the last 20 years, we've had people drink alcohol with black trumpets and get sick. Oyster mushrooms get sick. Chanterelles get sick. And these are commonly eaten mushrooms, very widely eaten. But every so often, as I remind my students, you have to pay attention to your own specific bodily functions and chemistry in order to ensure that you are okay with a particular mushroom. First. And then, of course, after that, if you want to have alcohol with your mushrooms, you're free to do so, but knowing that it's a little bit of a higher risk, because a lot of the reports we get of edible mushrooms, so-called, are ones that are consumed with alcohol that cause the problems. But we've got these 8 different toxin groups, and I only list that not because we're dealing with medicinal mushrooms, but in some ways we are. That is to say, medicines in the body from fungi are technically toxins. Technically, they are producing some type of response in the bodily system that is brought on by the ingestion of a particular chemical in the mushroom. And it just so happens that that response tends to ameliorate or enhance bodily functions, right? So, for example, we have muscarine as in the group 4 toxin, and that can, cause all kinds of issues, but it's also used medicinally in very small amounts. Muscimol, ibotenic acid, not so much. Psilocin, psilocybin, baeocystin, I hardly need to say what people consider as their own form of medicine, but we're entering an age where, for example, we have reinstituted trials at Johns Hopkins University with the use of psilocybin to treat schizophrenia. So here is a toxin, so-called group 6 toxin, that is actually being used medicinally for personality disorders. Schizophrenia, manic depression, and others have been shown to be benefited from the use of psilocybin. And I'm sure some of you have heard that or read it. Of course, we have a fairly recent sort of claim to fame in Michael Pollan's book about that subject. But nonetheless, I just want to point out that these toxin groups can sometimes contain mushrooms that are used in that fashion. So we jump into the medicinal value of mushrooms, and there are basically 6 different sort of categories of use. The most common of which, I list them roughly in order of how well they're known and how much they're used, are adaptogens. And adaptogens, briefly defined, are substances that help the body adapt to various environmental conditions, and that's either external and or internal environmental conditions. So for example, as it says, it will help balance hormones, it will help with your cellular respiration, which is necessary, it helps capture free radicals, it offsets maybe that double Big Mac that you had last week. And of course, it adds antioxidants to your system that will help, um, you know, cleanse the system of free radicals and other substances that would otherwise build up and cause a toxic reaction. Um, Adaptogens come in many, many different forms in terms of the mushroom world. Um, in the Chinese medicinal tradition, most of these were in the fleshy fungi, things like oyster mushrooms and lentinus mushrooms. Those groups were used as fleshy fungi for adaptogenic purposes. Second to that would be the immunomodulants and tonics. And these don't just build bone marrow, as I suggest, but they also reserve certain types of cells in your body that help address disease. And yes, the bone marrow is one location for that, but there are other reservoirs in the body where certain cells are built up, especially in your lymph system, that will help flush out toxic substances. So immunomodulant mushrooms and tonics are also very widely used, especially, and again, I refer to Chinese medicine since really Western medicine has only in the last 50 years gotten into looking at mushrooms as a source of, macro mushrooms as a source of medicine, whereas the Chinese, and I should say Eastern traditions, Korea, Japan, Laos, Thailand, all those countries in Eastern Asia have used mushrooms for thousands of years, and that's where most of our good knowledge comes from. Immune stimulants. There are probably more papers out now on a variety of immunostimulating mushrooms than you can shake a stick at this point. So chaga, and I'll talk about some of the most common ones, but chaga has sort of hit the ground and running and caused a lot of fanfare. If you just Google CHAGA, as most of you know, you will get dozens of websites advertising not only, it will cure everything, but also trying to sell you that product. And don't get me wrong, I'm not against that at all. I drink chaga tea pretty much every day in the wintertime as an immune booster. It's pretty straightforward, but we'll talk more about that specifically. But in general, immune stimulants increase macrophage activity, okay? And there are a number of them. Not all of the immune stimulant compounds certainly come in mushrooms. We have things like denamarin, which is a synthesized drug that stimulates antigen production in the liver and helps save people from dying from amanita poisoning. We've got a number of different products out there that stimulate the immune system either acutely or over a long period of time in order to, ward off things like COVID-19, right? And it's not a surprise that in an environment of increasing complexity and greater toxicity, certainly in all of our lifetimes, we need more substances that can help us offset the effects of unchecked diseases like COVID-19 or certain types of bacteria like the Lyme Borrelia or Babesia, all of the Lyme spirochete bacteria that are wreaking havoc. So these types of things are becoming more important. I'm glad that we have more information now to base our decision making on to improve our own health. We have a fourth group of mushrooms that lower blood pressure. There are a number of them. Perhaps the most widely used is the lion's mane or bear's tooth or hericium fungi. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then, of course, there are a number of mushrooms that lower cholesterol. And believe it or not, we have most of the polypores being very good at that, things you wouldn't even imagine. eating, or using medicinally, like turkey tails and um, violet tooth polypore, trichaptum, all the trichaptum genus species. And there's a number there are dozens of them literally, and a lot of them have that effect on not just lowering cholesterol, but regulating the LDL and the HDL levels in your body. And then last but not least, the brain function, which is also commonly attributed to lion's mane fungus in terms of one of its beneficial properties. But there are several others that will do that as well. Okay, how we doing? All right. So we have a number of different uses among those 6 sort of general treatment areas. And this list is probably half as long as it could be, but it gets at some of the specifics. The antibacterial I mentioned. I use a number of substances as an antibacterial, including mushrooms, and chaga is one of the ones that I tend to use. I've had chaga tincture for my Lyme disease for many years. Knock on wood, I'm symptom free. But I express more with Bartonella, which is one of the co-infections from Lyme disease. We have a lot of ticks up here. They run rampant. I'm a field worker. I get ticks on me every day, starting in mid-April all the way through, well, usually dies off the end of June, but because of the drought, we're still picking ticks off our dog and ourselves. And then back in the fall, the late instars arise again and cause a problem. So having some type of antibacterial to help treat the effects of Lyme is really helpful. Antitumorals, there are a lot of mushrooms that are used to reduce or mitigate the increase of tumors in the body from various cancers. And there's huge millions of dollars of research being spent, as you can imagine, on fungi and possible fungal extracts that can be used to treat cancer. And it's a very active and growing field. Antivirals, I mentioned. I also have seen that chaga has an antiviral property, so that's something that would be, I think, very useful. As a blood cleanser, I also mentioned that as well for lion's mane, cardiovascular enhancer, digestive aid, the liver protective, and there's a few of those that we can talk about in terms of improving the liver function. Regulating blood sugar is something yet again that chaga has been claimed to do, and I had one student attend one of my walks and had a real issue with that hypoglycemia, and it pretty much went away with his daily drinking of a couple of cups of chaga tea. Hypotensives, immune balancers, T cells, and so forth. We have a number of different actions that mushrooms can produce. I love the styptic because, of course, it's the blood stopper, and Pinella stypticus is a pretty darn common mushroom. Besides glowing in the dark up here, as probably we speak, it also stops bleeding, I should say. So that's a pretty neat one. So there's a picture of chaga, and for those who haven't seen, they're not always that big. That one was about a 40-pounder. It's probably one of the largest ones I've seen. It was about 3 feet high and about 2.5 feet wide on a giant yellow birch. Most of our chaga tea comes from, or I should say, most of our chaga is grown on birch, but nonetheless, it will occur on some other hardwoods occasionally. There are reports of it being on maple. I've seen it on hop hornbeam, so you can get it on other hardwoods, but almost always on birch. And here, like is mentioned, tea is typically the common way to ingest the beneficial properties of chaga, but you really have to boil it. And that's one of the things that, in sort of the plant world, boiling often destroys vitamins and destroys hormone balancers and things like that. But in the mushroom world, many of those compounds, especially the beta glucans, are locked into the cell walls, and therefore you need to do some boiling to break that down. Tincturing, most people tincture with some type of alcohol. If you can get 100 proof, um, that's even better. The higher, the better in terms of the extraction potential, but it also requires obviously that you cut it down. Otherwise, you'll burn your mouth out off with, when you put a 100 proof on your tongue. And of course, we have many different types of sort of formulations for tinctures. You can tincture a single mushroom. I tend to do a 30-day tincture with a 50% equal volume of the mushroom and 50% alcohol. Shake it once a day. And I usually do a lunar cycle, but that's just me. That's how I sort of learned it. You can do it for a shorter period of time or a longer period of time, depending on what you've got that you're trying to extract. Glycerin or honey works as well for those of you that have sensitivities to alcohol or wish not to ingest alcohol. It's a little more difficult, particularly when you're trying to get the more insoluble glucans out of your mushrooms. A lot of people will grind up the mushroom. I had a friend who had cancer who took ground up hen of the woods or Maitake capsules, and that was her form of ingesting the substances that were latent in the mushroom. And then, of course, you can always cook them like we do with our shiitakes, which is a great way to get the lentin into your system and have an extra antiviral immune boosting substance and have a tasty treat if you like shiitakes. So there's just a few case studies that I'll review, but there are many, many more. And I don't want to give you the impression that either I'm not a doctor, a medical doctor. I have a PhD, but not a medical degree. So I'm not going to sort of, I'll try not to swear by any particular substance and make any claims because there are none. And I always tell folks that, at the very outset, the first thing that you want to do is really realize that, yes, your good friend took, say, Chaga tea and got rid of his hypoglycemia. But is that going to happen for you? Your system is different. You're genetically different. The way you prepare your tea might be different. So just as a caveat for the next few slides, these are, the sort of symptom alleviation is from the literature and from anecdotal personal reports, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to work for you. Just want to make that very clear. Cordyceps, antitumorals, and it's interesting. This is Chinese largely. More recently, the improving the sexual function, but for many, many decades and hundreds of years, that was if there were any sort of cysts or fibroids or anything like that, those tumors were treated not topically, but internally, taking a variety of different cordyceps. We have cordyceps, Ophiocordyceps sinensis as the most common one, but in the North American continent, we have a Elaphiocordyceps, as you see depicted on the lower right. That's not Elaphiocordyceps, or actually Ophio. I'm sorry, they've changed the genera. Ophiocordyceps ophioglossoides, and then of course Cordyceps militaris on this cocoon, and so that's one that has been used for treating tumors. We have also seen use of erythroid progenitor cell stimulation by cordyceps, and that's something that is a little bit more specific, but is also pretty well described in the literature. It stimulates macrophage T cell production, just like a lot of immune boosters do, other immune boosters do, I should say. It's on the basis of that you have these galactoaminoglycans, which are again latent in the cell walls of the fruiting body, not the parasitized portion, but the above ground fruiting body. Lion's mane, great mushroom, easy to recognize. I have a friend who runs the Mid Hudson Mushroom Club and Stone Mountain Herbs. He has a great product line with this prominently featured. He's got, I think, 6 different tincture products, and John Michelotti, for those you might know. And John is great. He's got really high quality lion's mane tinctures that I have used for a regular basis. And so brain function, and that's one of the important things, obviously, especially as we get older. And but lest if I had you in a class, I'd be trying to remember your names. And yes, I can't remember it all because my brain function is maybe not as good. Now, if your name is Latin, yeah, scientific, yeah, I can do that pretty well. But in any case, it really helps with dementia and Alzheimer's disease, and those trials are ongoing. I mean, there's some active trials with Alzheimer's disease using lion's mane as a daily dose. And when I say daily dose, all you can do is say a standard formulation recommends 2 20-dropperfuls a day, and that's standard. But is that enough? Is it too much? I have only once heard of a case where something was too much, but other than that, and that had to do with chaga. But other than that, I doubt you're going to overdo a dose, as it were, of tincture. And of course, the biggest deal is it promotes brain neurite growth. Your nerve endings are, however, 10 to the 6 nerve endings in our brain. There's a lot of the neural activity that would be enhanced with lion's mane. I mentioned a lot about chaga. Keep in mind, this is something that a lot of folks may not know, that it's not a fruiting body, right? This is the mycelium of a polypore that infects the heartwood of a birch primarily, but also other hardwoods. And the canker that grows is a result of the tree trying to resist that fungus from taking hold. And it's that combination of the phytotoxins, and in this case I say toxins because the plant is emitting substances and trying to off the fungus, right? It's a result of that combination of the plant phytotoxins and the mushroom, the mycelial chemistry that produces the inotodiol. I can hardly say that. I always screw up. It's a made-up name, basically. It's an alcohol extract compound from Inotis, which is the genus for chaga, Inotis obliquus. And so that substance, again, has been used for a long time, but more recently has been shown to have beneficial effects in cancer diminution in mice. I mean, let's face it, our trials are largely done on mice, sometimes rats, and it's a laboratory situation. I only know of a few studies where it's been used on human patients in a double-blind situation, but those data were deemed insignificant. So it's really the mice studies that are cited typically, as Christopher does in his book, in terms of its anti-carcinogenicity. I mentioned it's antibiotic, antiviral, and one of the ways I prove that to myself is I had a pot of chaga on the stove, and at this cabin, this field site that I work at once a month, and I'd leave it just sitting in the air on the stove, come back a month later, and there wasn't one single skim of bacteria or mold growing on the water. Now, if that isn't a proof of antibacterial, I don't know what is, and antifungal, right? So that's one of its stronger attributes. it lowers blood pressure and regulates cholesterol. That was another story I had with one of my students who basically had his father and grandfather die from high blood pressure, and the doctor said, your levels are through the roof right now. You better do something because you'll be dead as well in less than a year. That's what, more or less, how he put it. And he took Chaga tea twice a day, and his LDLs and HDLs, particularly HDL, went down right into sort of normal levels without any other drug therapy. And so it was a great case study, for at least an anecdotal report. But that was his. He swears by Chaga, and that's what he says is keeping him alive. It does promote lymph drainage if you have inflammation. It's a good anti-inflammatory by, again, promoting the action in the lymph system to eliminate fluid and toxins from your body. So that's another really great use of Chaga. And of course, it's regenerative in the process of being transferred across stomach wall linings into the rest of your digestive system. Huan is one we know as the honey mushroom. It's one that has many, many different forms. The two that are mentioned in the literature are Armillaria mellia and tabescens, but we know, just because we've learned a little bit about the complex species group that honey mushrooms come in, that it's probably a number of different species that have been used. It is an antibiotic, an antibacterial, is antispasmodic, and an antitumoral. And this is, as I mentioned before, one of the fleshier fungi that has been used through consumption in Chinese medicine for a long period of time. The only downside, as you all are probably aware, or should be, is that it does cause an allergic reaction in some. And when I was taking my first mushroom course, my professor said 5%, 1 in 20. And he looked around the room and he said, okay, there are 23 of you in this class. One of you is going to be allergic. And darned if it wasn't me, And of course, I to this day I could kick myself that he proved it right. But I ate honey mushroom, got pretty darn sick, digestive upset, thrown up, all that stuff. But then, of course, honey mushrooms, for those who can eat this, is pretty tasty thing. So I thought, well, I was frozen. I'm going to try it again. I did again. Now you would think after 2 times that somebody who thinks and knows he's been taught that it's potentially causes an allergic reaction would have gotten it. But no, I had to go 3 strikes. Long story short, I don't eat honey mushrooms anymore. That's it. It's over. So for those who can, these are some of the properties that Huan is known to produce. I like the vasodilator thing too. That's really helpful for anybody with genetic heart disease. Muir, which is wood ear or Judas's ear, as it used to be called, excuse me, is growing on wood, usually small bark of or intact branch wood. And this one is perhaps most famously is a blood thinner. So those, and I'm not going to say anything about Coumadin or, can you substitute this for, blood thinners? But it's something that if there are conditions, and I would take this if I had a concussion and the doctor said, well, you got to watch for, blood clots and this could be a problem. I would probably go out in my backyard and look for some of this stuff. It's not that uncommon in the spring here in the Northeast. I don't know how common it is down there. There are also, of course, mohair, either MO air or MU air is sold in Chinese medicine shops or Chinese groceries. Actually, you can buy, they come in little strips, typically dried strips, black on one side, white on the other. And there again, you could manifest some of this from your grocery store without having to try and find it in the woods. but there are some various active heteroglycans that are interesting, and I wish I knew a little bit more about them, but in effect, they do help with inflammation, which again is a really good thing to have a handful of anti-inflammatory substances on hand in case you do have an issue um, with joint swelling or bursitis or any of that. It's also helpful post-surgery to prevent that inflammation as a part of your natural bodily response to heal itself from surgery. I don't know much about its anti-tumoral properties. That's listed in the pharmacopoeia, but I imagine that there's some data behind that as well. Okay, so one of my big favorites, yeah, big. That was about a 78 pounder right there with my friend Dave. I noticed that growing at the bottom of a birch tree, for God's sakes. Most of ours grow in the base of oaks. Occasionally we'll get it on ash, maple, but and I've only a couple times seen it on birch. Interestingly, if you pay attention to this or look close at this picture, that honey mushroom was growing also on the birch. And of course, I knew that spelled disaster for this hen of the woods, because sure enough, the next year, man, the honey took it right over. It was gone. Tree was down in 2 years. It was over, which is another reason that it's good to find a hen on oak, because they tend to last a little longer. But these guys are awesome. Maitake has you can buy this now in capsule form, tinctured form. A lot of naturopathic doctors, actually one of the ones I talked to in Florida was promoting this quite a bit, and as a cancer drug, and particularly breast cancer. There are other cancers it's been used for, but breast cancer seems to have in trials some positive beneficial help. I actually got my mother to take some of that when she had a bout with that several years ago. It does enhance macrophage activity, modulates the development of T cells. You don't want to have too many T cells in your system. Sort of like a white blood count. You want to have it in the right white blood cell count. You want to have it in the right levels. It also has some strong blood sort of modulation benefits, mostly in terms of lowering blood pressure by virtue of the steroids that it has. And that's something you cannot really easily get in tincture. That one is really, the steroids are, and terpenes are a little bit more, how shall I say, chemically sensitive. And so if you can get fresh material, it's a little bit better in terms of being more efficient relative to taking on those compounds. This is one of the ones that's used as a liver protector, and it's always good, I think, to have that if you have any kind of gallbladder issues, or sometimes you had a strong streak of drinking a lot of alcohol and you need to build your liver back up. There are a lot of plants that do this, but for the mushrooms, this is one of the better ones I know. And it also will bind up with heavy metals in your body and help transfer those out. So there's a lot of good sort of beneficial properties of Maitake, hen of the woods, Grifola frondosa, and I always look forward to late August. Hopefully we'll see some more rain this summer, and we'll see a few good Maitakes come out. Reishi and Ling, there are many different sort of names for this. Mushroom immortality is in the genus Ganoderma, and as many of you probably know, thanks to a couple of good works, Trad Cotter, I think, had a lot to do with one of his students in terms of teasing out Ganodermas. There's several different species in North America, 6 to be exact, and only one of them is the same as the rumored sort of Ling of Eastern Asia, and Ganoderma lucidum, as it were. We have Curtisii primarily in the Northeast, or you have Organense out west, and we have lucidum as well. But keep in mind, we also have the so-called red reishi, Ganoderma tsugi, which is on softwood, on hemlock primarily. Although I did find a tsugi on pine, so keep an eye out on other conifers. And we have probably a couple species that are undescribed. At least that's what, when we went to the Namaphore, the gentleman who presented on Ganoderma, posited that we do have yet a couple of more species to name. So these have beta-D glucans, which are anti-tumoral effects, and it has I don't know enough about necrosis factor A, but it's something that is treated by the reishi, and it stimulates through that RNA DNA transfer the replication of that factor to the benefit of the cell, the normal cell, natural cells, and to the detriment of the cancer cells. So this has been, again, studied like Chaga has for a long time, been used for a long time, and I can't say enough about reishi. And again, it's one of those things where some people seem to prefer to use reishi or take it as tincture or tea over Maitake for cancer. Other people will prefer Chaga. It's really a personal choice. There are a lot of terpenes in reishi, and a lot of that comes in that sort of tough outer shiny skin. That's where you're seeing a lot of those terpenes being developed. It's tough to get the terpenes out in this case. It's not like Maitake where the terpenes are readily given up upon cooking. This is one of the challenges with reishi, and straight alcohol tincturing doesn't get all the properties out that you could get out, especially relative to the terpenes in that outer skin layer. But nonetheless, that's some of the stuff that's listed for it. And of course, mushroom of immortality, I guess it did better darn well prolong life if it's got a name like that. So besides that, we're kind of getting to a close here. Mushrooms, don't forget, can produce a lot of spores. They can attack epidermal tissues. Believe it or not, we do have some contact dermatitis stuff in Southeast Asia, primarily the Pleurotus species, although it's kind of rare. It can have, mushrooms can also have, as I mentioned earlier, toxins that are cytotoxins. And so these are things that you need to keep in mind when you're taking mushrooms internally. The ones I mentioned, however, are with very, very few exceptions, have not caused any of these issues to take place. And when I say very few exceptions, I think, as I mentioned, one person I read at a tox report take lion's mane with alcohol and got sick from it. That was about it. Oh, and I did mention one other person who said that they had drunk so much chaga tea that they were having, what the heck was the issues? There was some detrimental symptom that he was facing with that, and that also hit the literature. There was a paper that Mike Bugh did, co-authored with, I can't remember the other gentleman's name, but it was about the possible causes of, overdoing it with chaga. I'm not so sure that's something that's very well documented, but again, it's very rare to have these detrimental symptoms from taking in medicinal fungi. But if they are ingested and you take too much, keep in mind that, of course, mushrooms will help recycle you, like it will all the rest of us, into the ground. So, okay. With that, I will go ahead and stop the screen share and go back to our gallery view. And Frank and Lori, let's see if we have one. That was it, just the full screen question. So I'd be happy to answer any questions any of you have, to the best of my knowledge.
Okay, I've gone ahead and unmuted everyone, but if you're still muted, then that means you have muted yourself. So you'll have to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. Okay. Noel is talking.
We're not hearing her.
But we're not hearing her.
Try using the chat function. Noel, try the chat function and we'll read your question.
What's the chat function? I have no idea. I know these people are using terms I don't know.
Almost here.
What's this? Let's see.
So if people are looking for the chat function, if you go up to the little bubble, that's where you would find the chat function. So the question is,
From Noel.
Rick, what do you think of the Paul Stamets products?
Paul Stamets products, yeah. You know, I think it's sort of the consumer's choice. I have ordered stuff from Fungi Perfecti for many years. I met Paul when I was at Evergreen State College in Olympia, where I graduated. And I've known of his work. I think he's got some great ideas here for fantastic fungi as a movie that has elevated the awareness of fungi among the common people. You all know how good fungi are already, but so product-wise, sure. I mean, it's up to you. If you find it to be a good product for you, terrific. Like I said, I've ordered stuff from him. I've gotten some spawn, but now I tend to support. Well, I do it mostly myself, but I'm not commercial. So if you don't do it yourself, you need to find a local outlet for mushroom tinctures. I encourage you to look around. I always like to go locally, unless there's no other choice. You know, I bet you somebody in Asheville is producing mushroom tinctures. I can imagine. Any of you on this call producing tinctures? Selling product?
Their Asheville Fungi in town sells them, as well as the French Broad Food Co-op. I think Red Moon Herbs may do it, and then Mushroom Mountain Trad Cotters.
Yeah.
They do tinctures as well. And there may be, I don't know if Deep Woods Mushrooms, if they do or not. They do other products, but I'm not they do spawn and things. I'm not sure if they do tinctures.
Oh, well, I see that Natalie just chimed in. She has reishi, lion's mane, shiitake, and cordyceps. I'm assuming tinctures. Oh no, she sells them whole, but tinctures are coming this winter. So great, Natalie. Thanks for that contribution.
Yeah, Lori and I have been, we've made a lot of herbal and mushroom tinctures. My background is in biochemistry, so I know how to do a lot of stuff. But I'll tell you, it's like being a backyard mechanic, right? When you don't have your own laboratory and your centrifuge and all your analytical instruments, you're sort of partially flying blind. That's why you need to get to know maybe some professors, friendly professors into mycology who might analyze a sample for you or something like that. But,
yeah, and that's a really good point, Frank, because it's something that, for example, there was a colleague of mine in Maine who sells chaga tinctures, and he said to me, "So, do you keep the black outer part as well as the inner sort of snuff cigar brown part?" And I said, "Yeah, I do both." He said, "Well, they have different constituencies. So if you want a particular element from your chaga tincture, keep in mind that the outer sort of crusty black part has different compounds in it than the inner snuff brown stuff." And it just begged the whole question of, do you actually know what's in the mushroom you have picked? Is it highly concentrated? Now in polypores, that's one thing, right? Generally, polypores have a consistent compound makeup. They have to in order to survive several winters, for example. But the fleshy fungi, you know, Maitake, hen of the woods, are the ones on oak more medicinal than on hickory, than on ash? And I can't answer these things. And that it bothers me that there is this level of imprecision relative to what we're actually extracting, and therefore being able to replicate should we find that there's beneficial symptomology thereafter. So I would suggest that each of you, you know, do run your own experiments, as it were, and see what works for you, and not necessarily rely on the advice of others.
Right. If you're making your own tinctures and you want to, you know, something new you're trying and you want to see if it's beneficial for you, you probably should make enough so that you can take that same batch over time. And again, myself with my background, I keep little laboratory notebooks and I write lots of stuff down. You know, now Lori keeps getting on my case because I'm sort of old-fashioned. I write all the stuff down in notebooks, and she says, you know, put it on some kind of, you know, like what is it, Evernote or something like that. She said, you know, if something happens to you, I'm not going to make heads or tails out of your piles of notebooks here, and you know.
Yeah. So for changing your will, Frank, it's BANGE.
So some of the things that we found is that it seems like birch is extremely powerful because of the betulinic acid.
Right.
And I believe the outer part of the chaga is
Yes.
that's where that component is found. And then also there's the birch polypore, what used to be Populinus, betulina, and is now whatever it is.
Yeah, it's Fomitopsis betulinus.
Okay, yeah.
It went to Fomitopsis, yeah.
Right, and so that is another medicinal mushroom. And just there are a number of medicinal compounds found with birch
Right.
traditionally.
We've also found that there's actually some tinctures that are supposed to enhance your immune system that actually are sort of contraindicated for Lori because she has RA, and it actually will aggravate her arthritis and tend
Right.
to counter some of the RA medicine she's taken that, you know, that specifically, I guess, suppresses part of her immune system. So you really do have to watch out for those things. And if you are going to, you know, treat yourself, you really need to keep notes and
Yes.
write down how much you're taking, when you're taking it, even with a meal or without a meal, what time of day, you know.
And you really do have to be careful because some of the things, say with COVID, there were some things posted online about using cordyceps to enhance the immune system. And then one medicinal expert was touting it, and then another woman was saying, oh no, you want to stay away from that because you don't want your overactive immune system, because you don't want to prime your system for
right, a cytokine storm. Or something, you know. So,
cytokine storm, right.
Right.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
and there you have it. There are generally two sides to every story.
Right.
And of course, if you have any questions, just look it up on the internet. It's got to be true.
Right.
Right. Now, actually,
Well,
when you were talking about the chaga, actually, it's being in the southern Appalachians. It's being so aggressively harvested that it's being what is it called? Expatriated from the area.
Extirpated.
Extirpated, right?
Extirpated,
right?
yeah.
As opposed to right, leaving the country or whatever. Right.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, well, that's an issue that some people in Connecticut and Massachusetts have pointed out because they don't have very much chaga. That said, most of those people are now coming to New Hampshire for their chaga, or Maine, or in certain places, Vermont. Well, they're here anyway for the summer, but the point being is that um, there is a commodity that we're dealing with that, and I pointed this out to the White Mountain National Forest, our national forest in the Northeast, besides Green Mountain. Actually, they're already on it, to where chaga is not a renewable resource,
Right.
right? It will disappear. I mean, it does grow back to a certain degree, but if the tree is on its way out, it won't regrow. If the tree is young and pretty healthy, it will regrow. And one of our, I won't mention names, but one of our leading sellers of chaga in this state has made some rather broad claims which have been proven untrue. And I've, as a scientist, have gone into fairly, rigorous studies to determine A, how much chaga is on the landscape, and B, if it's harvested, how much does it grow back? And, some point we will have a price increase because the demand is higher than the supply. That's bound to happen. And certainly in places like perhaps the Southern Alps, that is beginning to happen. Southern New England as well. But it's something to keep in mind. And of course, I had one of my favorite stories as well is I had a lady attend a walk, and she said, "Oh, I got a 35-pound chaga the other day. It's awesome." And I said, "So what are you going to do with it?" And there was this blank stare. 35 pounds of chaga would serve probably 100 people for 6 months.
right.
So keep in mind that if you do harvest chaga, you don't need to take the whole darn thing. Take as much as you think you're going to need and will remain in a relatively fresh state for the next 6 months, no more. And then go back out and harvest another one, because otherwise it's a waste.
Yeah.
No, just with chaga. Most of the rest of the stuff are fruit bodies, but chaga is a canker. So
Right. Right.
anyway. Well, it's great talking to everybody, and I appreciate your hosting, Frank and Lori. It's good to see you again,
Sure.
Yes.
All right.
and I look forward to another round.
Yeah. Yes, we all do. All right. Well, thank you, Rick. And if there's no more questions, we will close this meeting. Thank you all for attending.
Okay,
All right. Bye-bye.
bye for now.